Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. It's a somber day for the RCMP community. This afternoon, a regimental funeral for fallen Constable Rick O'Brien will take place. A procession starts at 12:45 Pacific. We'll bring that to you live. And a big national story today is the Manitoba election, where Wabkanu will become the first First Nations provincial premier. We'll hear reaction from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. But first, a report finds BC's 2021 wildfire and flooding response was outdated and poorly communicated. What's your experience? I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. Thank you for joining us on CBC Radio 1. We're live streaming too on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. Emergency and disaster management was top of mind as BC politicians began the fall legislature session yesterday. New sweeping changes were introduced to how the province manages climate-related natural disasters. That includes incorporating the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and putting more onus on local governments to mitigate and prepare for risks. The province is also creating an expert task force to better respond to emergencies like wildfires. And this is all on the heels, of course, of the worst wildfire season on record in this province. Throughout the summer on this program, we heard from callers who were unhappy with provincial response to wildfire emergencies. And here's a selection of those calls to BC Today on August 23rd. We'll hear from Bob in West Kelowna in a moment. First, though, you'll hear Beria from the North Shuswap.
Most of my neighbors have lost their houses, but there's 4 houses left, and it's mostly all my family because we all live near each other. But the only reason it's still there is because there are a team of local people. There's pockets of teams of local people all across the North Shuswap, and it's just so upsetting. And I was just trying to send supplies, and I've gotten turned around. The people manning the road don't seem to be familiar with the areas. There's all this police there, and they're not helping put out the fires. They're just maintaining that people not leave their property. It's really upsetting.
If a man decides to risk his life to protect his home from the wildfire, it's not okay for the civil authorities to intervene with his efforts and to block the efforts of his friends to support him. He did the right thing. He was doing his civic duty. He defended his home and the homes of his neighbors.
Those were calls to this program on August 23rd. Now, an update on wildfires. As of today, there are no more wildfires of note, but there are still more than 330 active wildfires in the province. We do want to hear from you on this. What was your own experience, perhaps as an evacuee during the BC wildfires this summer or in previous years? What do you think needs to be better? How would you rate BC's wildfire response? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, and you can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. By email, you can reach us at bctoday@cbc.ca. And joining us now is Kira Hoffman, a fire ecologist who works with the UBC and Bulkley Valley Research Center, also a former wildfire fighter. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We've been hearing a lot about emergency management and wildfire-related action in the BC legislature yesterday, the same day as this report from the Ombudsperson on BC's 2021 response. How would you assess how seriously the province is taking disaster response after this year, the worst wildfire season on record?
Well, I think the province is really trying to get a lot of support together quickly in order to, face the problems that likely come after wildfires. So wildfire is one of those cascading disturbances that's linked to flood, is linked to infrastructure problems, road maintenance. So my guess is that with, an El Nino on the way, which we can expect potentially heavier rainfall, more atmospheric river events, that they're trying to prepare as quickly as they can for potential other related disasters that are likely to impact British Columbia in this coming fall, winter. And of course, we've had a long fire season. It's October, it's still
Yeah.
going. We could see a return to an earlier fire season again next year.
For yourself, what did you observe when it came to the emergency response from the province over the summer?
Well, it was a very challenging summer for first responders. So for BC Wildfire, for First Nations communities, for many of the contract crews that were dealing directly with wildfires within their communities, wildfires in the places that they recreate or have valuable resources and non-timber values, especially. I think that everyone felt a real strain this summer, and the public did too. So it was a very complex situation, one that was talked about a lot. I think that most scientists and a lot of people who have been looking at the potential to have a wildfire season like this, they kind of knew it was always kind of around the next horizon. I think people held their breath each time a wildfire season came, but I wouldn't say it's been surprising. We had 2017, 2018, 2021. We are going to see more extreme wildfires. So I think that, it's very difficult. I don't know if we were really ready, but again, very complex situation.
Yeah. Does that surprise you or frustrate you, to feel that you didn't know if we were really ready given 2017 and years since?
Well, it's very difficult with the amount of fire suppression that we've had over the last 100 years. We are trying to fix a problem that has been facing us for a really long time and goes against some of the economic values that we have, some of our social values, where we choose to live. We haven't had a very good relationship with fire, but there is a lot of examples of communities that have very strong relationships with fire, especially Indigenous communities where they've lived with fire for thousands of years. They've harnessed fires, they've used fire to care for their lands and protect their plants and animals. So I think that, we can't, when much of Canada was colonized, again, when people came here, they saw this open land and didn't realize that this was a fire enhanced landscape, that this land had been managed for thousands of years of fire. They saw these open park-like landscapes and just assumed it would always be that way. And so the fire suppression paradigm is one that's really difficult to overcome.
And my guest is Kira Hoffman, who's a fire ecologist and a former wildfire fighter, now works with the UBC and Bulkley Valley Research Center. We are asking you, how would you rate BC's wildfire emergency response? And let us know what was your own experience, perhaps this summer or in summers before. Our numbers are 1-800-825-5950. 604-669-3733 and pound 690 on your cell phone. Marietta is joining us from Grand Isle. And so this is up north between Smithers and Burns Lake. What's your experience, Marietta?
Well, this summer I worked at the Grand Isle Info Center, and we were getting a lot of notices about fire alerts and different things. And we found that the formatting that we were getting wasn't jiving with the Facebook site that we had in Grand Isle because we didn't have a website. And so it was difficult for us to make it work because sometimes we get an error saying that it was classed as news and they wouldn't let us post it. And then we had to reformat it in a different way and figure out what we could do to make it work so that the information could get out. So it was kind of difficult for us to get things done in a timely manner sometimes because it was not straightforward just getting sent the information and then having to repost it in a different manner.
Right. What was the lag time?
Well, it depended on who was working because it was a split between me and one other lady, and so she had better technology than I had. So usually it would wait for her because she'd take pictures of it with her phone and then repost it that way rather
Wow.
than having to go through the regular link, and it was just really weird.
That sounds like a workaround.
Yeah,
Yeah. You had a lot on your shoulders in Marietta.
yes.
How did that
Because
feel?
I was the first of the week, and so I'd get the notices, and I tried to, do what I could with what I got so that people would know something, but I couldn't post it as with the link that I was sent the same way that it was sent from the original source. So.
Did you in your interactions with other residents, did that come up in conversation, the delays or the challenges of trying to get that information to them in a timely manner?
Actually, most of the fires are in outlying areas, but
Yeah.
it was related to them because it was their family members. So it was more of a concern in that way that how could they help if they knew what was being evacuated or what was doing, so that they could be backup for them. Because we were fortunate to not actually have the fires right close to us. We did get smoke from time to time, but
Right.
the wind blew it off. So we were fortunate that way.
Further south, and whether they would have to welcome some family members who would be traveling up to them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would have helped you?
I
It sounds like
think
an update.
that maybe a link that would be suitable for Facebook that wouldn't conflict in the, that maybe there's different formatting you could use because in the info centers, we don't always have our own website. So if we don't, then we rely on Facebook, and then it's, restricted now because of the news and everything. So.
And Mariette, before I let you go, do you plan to do this? Unfortunately, we expect this to happen again, perhaps next year or
Yeah.
subsequent years. Is this
Well,
something?
it's seasonal hiring, but they liked me, so who knows?
Well, you've made some important suggestions, Marietta. Really important to hear from you today. Thank you.
Okay, have a good day.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye bye. Marietta calling us from Grand Isle. Communication has always been a challenge. Kira Hoffman, what about that? Even as simple as the formatting and trying to be able, being able to post information on various formats, various outlets.
Yeah, it's communication in wildfire response and disaster response is incredibly important. And mostly we just assume that those lines of communications are always open. A lot of the time they aren't. That's part of the problem, especially in northern communities, in remote indigenous communities where there just isn't cell service either. And it can be really jarring when there's a lot of smoke in the air. A lot of British Columbians felt smoke all around, so it wasn't clear always if there was a wildfire burning even close to your community. In Babine, Lake Babine Nation, there was examples of conservation officers boating out to communities to hand out paper evacuation notices, and so it can be really, I think, challenging and scary for people when they can't access information. And that's true across many places where there just isn't cell service. There's not always strong internet connections. And when these disasters do happen, then they can really clog up those communication lines.
Yeah.
So it's not as reliable.
And something we heard over the summer was, wildfire officials, local officials going door to door, having to go door to door in those communities.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's not always possible
Yeah.
if there is a fast-moving wildfire. So it can lead to really dangerous situations.
And I'll put up the phone numbers once again, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. Let us know what your own experience was. Perhaps you are an evacuee over the 2023 wildfire season, or a volunteer or a worker, as Marietta was in Grand Isle. Let us know what the challenges were for you. What were the successes? What worked and what didn't? How would you rate BC's emergency response system? And my guest, Kira Hoffman, who's a fire ecologist, a former wildfire fighter as well, and now works with the UBC and Bulkley Valley Research Center. And Kira, yesterday, as the province put forward this bill and put together a task force and legislation to deal with emergency response, also came a report from the provincial ombudsperson, Jay Chalk, on the government's response to wildfires and the atmospheric river in 2021. They used that as a case study, and he called that response that year outdated and inaccessible. Here he is now speaking with CBC's On the Coast about how evacuation supports have not kept up with today's climate realities.
The main immediate program, called Emergency Support Systems, is designed to support people for up to 72 hours. But with climate change, what we're seeing, and we used the 2021 wildfires and the atmospheric river displacements and flood as a case study. What we're seeing is that displacement is much broader, way more people, and for far, far longer. Some 90% of the people who were displaced in 2021 needed support for more than 72 hours. So the system was good at a particular point in time, but it's not really fit for purpose anymore.
That's Provincial Ombudsperson Jay Chalk speaking to CBC's On the Coast yesterday. I listened to that interview, and he talked about sort of a one-size-fits-all response, right? Addressing things like shelter and food, but everybody's situation is different. He talked about a family whose child needed insulin, and we're worried about that. Another family who had a member with dementia and had to sit outside a response center for a day, in the heat, and just how that exacerbates their situation. What needs to change, do you think, in dealing with what people need in the immediate aftermath?
Yeah, I mean, these are all really, really good points, and we've seen it time and time again that these evacuations and the impacts of it are lasting, days, months, sometimes years. There needs to be greater support, but again, it comes with having those supports in place. A lot of the time, it's not just the communities that are impacted; it's hospitals, and so sometimes it becomes a triage where the people who have the most pressing needs are the ones where a lot of the support goes to. But of course, I think it needs to be a bigger channel. We need to have communities supporting other communities. That's already in place, but I think it probably needs to scale up. More funding into preventative measures and making sure that communities are able to respond to disasters, that they can be as independent as possible, that they have the resources they need, the people they need in those positions to coordinate response, to make sure that, as many houses and infrastructure is protected as possible with the right building material. So there's a long, a long pathway here to what true preparedness looks like. But I think that there's encouraging first steps. I know that it can be really challenging, and that there's probably been a lot of mistakes made along the way, but hopefully we're learning from those. It's very hard to see, again, Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted, about 40% more likely to be evacuated from a wildfire. We've just seen some ends to evacuation orders just today in the north. These evacuation orders went on for months. So that's a long time for displacement.
Yeah.
A long time, and people don't have places to go necessarily, or again, the things that they need in order to feel safe in that evacuation space.
Let's take another call now. And certainly West Kelowna was very much impacted by the McDougall wildfire, and Wendy is joining us now. Hi, Wendy.
Hi. I'm listening, thinking it must be so unbelievably difficult to be in a remote community, because it is that much harder. We moved from the coast, from the Lower Mainland to West Kelowna, July the 21st. 3 weeks later, on August the 17th, we were evacuated for 9 days. And We had no clue what was going to happen from the McDougall wildfire. It literally came up, and I saw the smoke. I was standing on my driveway, looking at the smoke with flames on the ridge above our home, and I'm thinking, what have I just moved into? And while we were evacuated, they declared a state of emergency very quickly, and we went from literally 170 firefighters to over 500 overnight. And we had fire trucks from everywhere that had descended upon West Kelowna and fought like tooth and nail to save thousands and thousands of homes, including our own. And that fire came to within 100 feet of our house, and it literally burnt the fence that around our strata community. And if it wasn't for that response, I would not have a house to even go home to today. Just flat out, that's just the way it was. It was incredible what happened up here.
Yeah, and Wendy, I can hear the gratitude in your voice as you describe that.
Oh, I'm so grateful. Like, I cannot believe how the communities all came together, how people just reached out, I was displaced for 9 days, and I can't even imagine if there wasn't that help, that if the city didn't declare that state of emergency and the province is like, okay, listen, we need help, like now. And it was an extremely fast-moving fire, and the way that the wind changed the next day, that's where the problem came, because it went from going one direction to right back onto the city, and that's where the problem came from, and everybody was unreal. But again, maybe it's because it's a bigger city. I don't know. But all I have is gratitude for every single person who was involved in this.
Wendy, yeah, and I hear the gratitude in your voice, and certainly very good to hear, your story and the kinds of stories that can happen when the response is that fulsome and quick. And certainly the McDougall wildfire was one of the big fires around BC. Thanks so much for calling. Really good to hear from you today.
Thank you.
Wendy makes a great point there. She says, I can't imagine what it would be like for a remote community to have not the same kind of access to response. You talked about how Indigenous communities do not have a disproportionately lack of access to supports. How do we ensure that there is equitable response, Kira?
It's a very challenging question. I think that really valuing the expertise that's within Indigenous communities is incredibly important. There is a lot of skilled firefighters, people who are very savvy with equipment and really know how to fight wildfires. And so there has been some tensions around, being there to defend some of the land, some of the territory, as well as homes. But as I think things have changed in a significant way, and we've seen collaboration and partnerships between agencies and First Nations. So there have been many communities, Indigenous communities, that really should feel very proud of how many fires that they were able to action this year, and how they really put themselves in harm's way and in a very safe and respectful way to really protect so many of their homes, as well as, several other communities, because those wildfires were very big and they had the potential to not just impact these remote communities, but spread into other very populated areas.
You've outlined some very far-reaching needs when it comes to prevention, as well as response, and the need for hospitals to be ready. We'll look to see what this legislation does. Thanks so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you again for having me.
That's Kira Hoffman, a fire ecologist, a former wildfire fighter, and now works with the UBC and Bulkley Valley Research Center. It's 12:30 now, 1:30 in the Mountain Time Zone. You're with BC Today here on CBC Radio 1 and live streaming on cbc.ca/BC, on CBC Gem, and on the CBC Vancouver's YouTube page. Coming up in our next half hour, the funeral procession for RCMP Officer Constable Rick O'Brien will begin at 12:45. He was a member of the Ridge Meadows RCMP detachment, and we'll bring that procession live to you. That's coming up after this CBC News Update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. A candlelight vigil will be held at Fraser River Heritage Park in Mission this afternoon to mark the National Day of Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. It is one of several events today. The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples says 4 years after the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, just 3 of the 231 calls for justice have been partially completed. A man is dead after an industrial accident at Cypress Mountain. Police say the 26-year-old operator of a front-end loader got caught under the machine after it started to roll. The name of the victim, who was from Ontario, has not been released. And as Michelle mentioned, a procession is about to begin in Langley for RCMP Constable Rick O'Brien. He was shot and killed last month while executing a search warrant in Coquitlam. The 51-year-old joined the RCMP in 2016 and is remembered by friends and family as a humble and genuine person. And now the forecast on the north coast. Periods of rain this afternoon with a high of 10. Highs around 13 and mainly sunny in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 12 degrees. Highs around 19 with lots of sunshine in the Kootenays. In the Okanagan, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 20. And mainly cloudy this afternoon in Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley. Clearing in Greater Victoria with highs around 15. I'll have more local news at the top of the hour. Now back to Michelle with BC Today.
Thank you very much, Rob. That's Robert Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Welcome back. You're with BC Today here on CBC Radio 1. We're live streaming as well on cbc.ca/BC, the CBC Vancouver YouTube page, or you can use the CBC Gem app. And as Rob mentioned, that funeral procession for Constable Rick O'Brien will begin in about 15 minutes from now, and we'll take you there live, bring you some of the procession as it begins as well. The funeral will be at the Langley Events Center at 2 p.m. Pacific time, and we will carry that for you here as well on CBC Vancouver's YouTube page, on our website to cbc.ca/BC. And in a few moments, we're also going to get some reaction to one of the biggest national stories today, and that is the election in Manitoba, where Wab Kinew will become the first First Nations provincial premier. And we're going to get some reaction, trying to connect right now with the UBC Indian Chiefs, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and Grand Chief Stuart Phillip. And we'll get some reaction to that election coming up in a few moments. In our last half hour, we were asking you how you would rate BC's wildfire emergency response. Yesterday, the province did release and introduce legislation to deal with wildfire emergency response, and as well putting together a task force to address it. We heard from Kira Hoffman, who is a fire ecologist, on what needs to be done. You heard her say there needs to be a very comprehensive plan dealing with prevention as well as response. And as well, yesterday, the Ombudsman for BC, Jay Chalk, released a report as well, looking at BC's 2021 response, saying it was outdated and inaccessible. So we've been asking you for your thoughts, your experience, perhaps this summer during BC's worst wildfire season on record. And Richard called us from North Vancouver. Richard's on the line now. Hi there.
Yeah, hi. I'd actually like to comment from a position of being on Lasqueti Island, which is an island about the size of Bowen Island between Texada and Parksville. And it has walk-on ferry-only access. Mm-hmm. So if we get fire, the availability of any response crews will be slow, to say the least. I would like to see the province consider accepting the training of local groups that can access a fire instantly, and then either back away when the regular troops arrive or become part of it, because people could take the wildfire training. There are trainers all throughout the province, and it costs roughly about $200 a head. And these brigades need to exist outside of the volunteer fire departments, because if they exist within the fire department, they're subject to the liability concerns of the regional districts. And that way, the citizens can use whatever equipment they have available. And at least all of us on the island are to some degree equipped.
Yeah.
But it's not standardized equipment. And the other thing two other things, I would like to see the recycling of all of the fire hoses and other equipment that is stale dates throughout all the fire departments in BC and put those out to the fire brigades, as well as a mandatory standardization of fittings for all fire pumps sold in BC. Because right now, there's a million different fittings for hoses and pumps. And when you bring groups of people together, the equipment isn't compatible. And it makes it very, very difficult. So if the province could accept local help, train the local help to the same standards as the firefighters are, it's a 2-day course, and accept them as existing outside of the equipment liability restrictions of government, then we could utilize our people and our equipment throughout the province.
Richard, thank you so much for the call from North Vancouver, but speaking to the experience of being on Lasqueti Island and what happens when access is cut off. We saw that, of course, on Vancouver Island when Highway 4 was closed down, and that was the only way, of course, from the coast of the island to the mainland in communities like Tofino and Ucluelet. And that point about training locals, we certainly heard that as well when it came to training people in the North Shuswap, people who the province, the wildfire service considered to be experienced in dealing with local wildfires there. So thank you very much for raising those points as well. That's Richard calling us from North Van today. It's 12:38, 1:38 in the Mountain Time Zone. And as I mentioned, one of the biggest national stories today comes out of Manitoba. Now, the province has elected the NDP to a majority government, making leader Wab Kinew premier. And he makes history as the first First Nations premier of a province. Kinew describes this as a victory for all of Manitoba. And this morning, he appealed for unity.
Over the course of this campaign, we saw many messages focused on division. And I want to say that I am extraordinarily proud that our province chose to rise above that sort of division. And that you, the people of Manitoba, good people that you are, chose to embrace a positive message for the future of our province.
Now, reaction has been pouring in from across the country, including from Indigenous leaders in BC. Joining me now is Union of BC Indian Chiefs President, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip. Good afternoon, Grand Chief Phillip. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
How are you feeling about the election of Wab Kinew as Premier of Manitoba?
I'm absolutely over the moon. I'm thrilled. As a grandfather of 15 grandchildren, Wab Kinew's victory will ripple across the country and bodes well for all of our grandchildren and future generations.
There have been Indigenous premiers of territories, and he becomes the first First Nations premier of a province. How significant is that in your view?
I think it's hugely significant. It validates the path forward in terms of the outcome of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Reconciliation is a no-brainer and represents the future of Canada. And I think Wab Kinew has ably demonstrated with his NDP team that it's possible to move away from the archaic colonial notions of governance to a broader perspective that's inclusive of all people. And that bodes well for all of our futures in this time of crisis in regard to the disasters vis-a-vis the climate crisis.
And given his background, how optimistic are you that issues affecting Indigenous peoples in Manitoba will be addressed? He has vowed to continue forward with the search of a landfill for the remains of 2 First Nations women who police alleged were killed by a serial killer. He has criticized the outgoing government for their decision not to do so. How optimistic are you that those kinds of issues will now be addressed?
Well, clearly, that was part of the NDP campaign under Wab Kinew's leadership, and I think now we have a great opportunity to move forward on the racist notions in regard to Indigenous people, missing and murdered Indigenous women, children that were apprehended and continue to be apprehended, and so on and so forth. And what our forward progress depends on is largely leadership that has a vision and is focused and deeply committed to moving that agenda forward. And I believe Wab Kinew will do that for not only Manitoba, but this entire country.
And given some of the promises of the federal Liberals, for example, to deal with clean water that have still not been fulfilled, how confident are you that he can work within that system to bring about change?
Well, I think the winds of change are sweeping across this country. And I think eloquent rhetoric, empty promises, and it's just not working for anyone. We're in a deep crisis, inflation, the opioid crisis, COVID, not to mention the climate crisis. And we need new leadership with a new, more inclusive vision. And I think under the leadership of Wab Kinew, he will continue to inspire other regions, other provinces to begin to look toward alternatives as opposed to the same old archaic ideas and notions of the same old archaic political parties.
Grand Chief Philip, I know you're at the UBC-IC Annual General Assembly today, so I appreciate your jumping out of a busy day to speak with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That is the Union of BC Indian Chiefs President, Grand Chief Stuart Philip. It's 12:43, 1:43 in the Mountain Time Zone. And yes, we are going to bring you live coverage of the regimental RCMP funeral of Constable Rick O'Brien. That funeral is set to begin at 2 p.m. this afternoon. But in a couple of minutes from now, the funeral procession is set to begin outside the Abbotsford Hospital. And CBC's Liam Britton joins me now from the start of that procession. Liam, hello.
Hi, Michelle.
Tell us where you are. I can see on our live stream here some officers ready to start the procession behind you. Can you describe what it looks like around you right now?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, you're seeing kind of the start of the procession here. My colleague Murray, you can kind of have a look. We're just at the start here. You can see that there's some Mounties with a flag. There's the pipers, the drummers, sabers in hand. Obviously, the red surge is just everywhere here. The campaign hats. We've seen the hearse for Constable Rick O'Brien. That's the light gray vehicle just in the driveway there. And things, as you can hear, obviously just beginning now.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a listen. We We, of course, are hearing the bagpipes as the funeral procession begins and the Mounties make their way outside Abbotsford Hospital. They will be making their way to the Langley Events Center, where the funeral will take place this afternoon at 2 p.m. Liam, if you can hear me, tell us more about what's going to happen during this procession and at the funeral this afternoon.
Right. Well, this is going to be a quite an impressive spectacle for a very sad occasion, the death of Constable Rick O'Brien. The hearse now just passing us by with dozens of his colleagues in the Mounties marching alongside it.
We see it making the turn there, the silver hearse with the Canadian flag in front, some Mounties marching behind it as the funeral procession gets underway. Liam, thank you very much for this. We'll continue to bring pictures to our live stream throughout the rest of our program. Really appreciate your joining us and telling us how it's beginning this afternoon. That's CBC,
anytime, Michelle. Thank you.
CBC reporter Liam Britton. And we are going to talk more about this. And of course, you can watch more this afternoon on our program and watch the funeral as well as we live stream it on our website, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. And I'm joined now here in studio by retired Sergeant Major Seb Lavoie to talk more about the impact of the death of RCMP Officer Constable Rick O'Brien on the force and how somber this day is. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Honored to be here, Michelle.
What is on your mind today?
Well, first off, my condolences, my sincere condolences to Rick's family, to his colleagues, to the community, quite frankly, who've lost an amazing, by all account, an amazing officer, community-oriented officer. And yeah, it's a very somber occasion, but it is all too common nowadays.
I can hear that in your voice and see it on the faces as well of the Mounties as they proceed on their march. And as we bring you live pictures on our live stream of the funeral procession of RCMP Constable Rick O'Brien. O'Brien was a decorated constable with the Ridge Meadows RCMP detachment. He was fatally shot late last month while executing a search warrant at a residence in Coquitlam. A 25-year-old Coquitlam resident is charged with first-degree murder. The regimental funeral will start at 2 p.m. Pacific time at the Langley Events Center, and crowds are expected to be there. You can see some of that procession taking place now. And I'm joined here in studio by retired Sergeant Major Seb Lavoie. And you mentioned this is something that happens all too often. He was killed in the line of duty while executing a search warrant. What are the risks of that? What are the dangers that officers face?
Yeah, you know, in our profession, risk assessment is absolutely everything, and evidently there's always a risk, and we can go to great length to try to make it as safe as we possibly can. But ultimately, there is an element there that we don't control, and that's external behaviors and external factors. So we can try to account for external factors as much as we can, but at the end of the day, everybody gets a vote. And so sometimes it goes our way, others not so much.
I can imagine that day to have been very difficult, and today to be very difficult, and you know the previous weeks and the months to come. What is the impact on a force when one of their own is killed in the line of duty?
Yeah, I don't know if I can be so bold as to speak on behalf of everybody, but certainly from my experience and from what I observed, there's a variety of complex emotions. We have the grief, which is expected, but the grief is set in a bit of a setting that's different on account of people have to have the ability to continue to work. People have to go to the next call. And, you know, 5 minutes after something happened with Constable O'Brien, there was other calls that were continuing to come. So the grief and going through the grieving process while maintaining the service to the community is sort of the challenge. And so, you know, all hands on deck, so to speak, to try to get in there and relieve some pressure on the affected members, the colleagues, the people that worked with them. But I think also there is a bit of an association by proxy where people all around the country can relate because they've done the same job, the same duties. They've done warrant execution. You know, this could have been them for all intent and purposes. And so it does reverberate deep into the core.
That's traumatizing, to be sure. And I know that you don't speak for Ridge Meadows RCMP. You worked in Tofino and on the Lower Mainland District Emergency Response Team before becoming the BC RCMP Sergeant Major. But what was your experience or your observation of the kinds of supports that are there, grief supports and trauma supports for Mounties?
Yeah, you know, this is a very convoluted, and of course, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, right? We have to look at providing care on an extended basis, but what we also have to worry about is the constant exposure to trauma. So one of the issues with policing is that constant exposure to trauma. So, you know, you're grieving for a fallen comrade. A couple of days later, another fallen comrade lost his life in Montreal. And so, you know, this continues to be brought to bear. And yes, there are services and peer services and organizationally we have services that help our members. But really, the bulk of that is going to come from within the ranks. It's going to come mostly from us as peers and colleagues, you know, to keep the memory alive, lest we forget, to make sure that we pay attention to each other, that we monitor each other, that we establish some baseline on each other, and that we're able to sort of move forward collectively.
And to that end, you know, to remember, lest we forget, as you said, how important is a ceremony like today?
It's in fact, it's extremely important, and it's one of the sort of it's one of the aspects that make the RCMP different. And we have regimental honors. The RCMP were bestowed upon the RCMP in 1921 by George V. And as a result of that, we have regimental colors, and we can put together something meaningful for the fallen, to honor the fallen, the sacrifice, but also for the families, also for the colleagues, and for everybody to know that a sacrifice was made on account of the collective. And then from there, you know, there's a bit of closure, there's historical and ceremonial aspect of the ceremony that really feed into this. And so it's critically important that we have that.
We did see as well a call as well from his wife for people to wear red today. How common is that? And what does that mean to the community, the broader community, as you say?
Yes, the red is, you know, we see it with the Red Friday as well in support of military veterans. We see it and this is a color that was agreed upon by, you know, the BC RCMP. So I'm not sure exactly what the
process was
behind it, but I'm going to surmise that it had to do with the Red Surge and representing the organization and the support to the organization.
Okay, we're going to check in once more. My guest right now in studio, retired RCMP Sergeant Major Seb Lavoie. Thank you so much for joining us on this day.
Thank you.
And we're going to check in one more time with CBC reporter Liam Britton, who is on the line of the procession as it makes its way. Started just about 10 minutes ago outside the Abbotsford Hospital and making its way to the Langley Event Centre, where the regimental funeral will take place at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Liam, we can see now some more officers in uniform making their way through the procession. Tell us more. I know you've been speaking with people in the crowds. You know, tell us more about what brought them there today.
Well, in addition to these marchers, I believe the RCMP estimate there are about 3,000 in all, officers from all over the Lower Mainland. We heard from some people, you know, just from the community who felt that it was important to be here. I want to bring you the voice of Sandra Palmer. She's one person I spoke to just a few minutes ago.
I had a brother-in-law and family members that have been members, and regular police, of course, you know, so I mean, they say they put their life on the line every day, and they get a bit of a raw deal sometimes in that, but respect totally.
So yeah, you saw That was Sandra. We're meeting people who are wearing red, some people improvising. Sandra said that was her only red jacket, one person with a 49ers jersey to try and honor what was requested by the widow.
What do people need to know about the funeral today and where people who perhaps are not there can watch?
Yeah, so at 2 o'clock at the Langley Event Center, that's where the funeral itself will be happening. Between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, there will be a final salute outside the Langley Event Center. So media generally, there's one photographer allowed from the media to attend the funeral, but at the family's request, there won't be media there. We're told that, or we've seen an Instagram post from Constable O'Brien's wife who's expressing thanks for the support and the love that has been outpouring from the communities that they called home. So, a spectacle, but a sad one today.
Liam, thank you so much for joining us. That's CBC's Liam Britton. And in our last moments here on the program, I'm joined again in studio by retired Sergeant Major Seb Lavoie. What does it mean to you, having been retired, but of course feeling this connection? What does it mean to you to witness this today?
It reaffirms that one is too many. It reaffirmed that we've had way too many over the last year, I believe 13 in total, which is unprecedented in the country. It also brings to bear some questions with respect to who are these offenders and how are they out doing the things that they are doing and causing harm. And so there's a lot of questions for me. I want to be, and I will respectfully, let the procession and the funeral service unfold as it should. And then after, it would be very beneficial for our members, for the membership to start having some answers to these difficult questions so that we can look to the future. How do we prevent these deaths in the future? And understanding very well that we can't prevent them all. But how can we prevent those that can be preventable? And is everything in our power or within our scope of influence can help?
Thank you so much for joining us. I know this is difficult for you, and thank you for being so thoughtful in being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
That is retired RCMP Sergeant Major Seb Lavoie. And you can watch continuing coverage of the full regimental procession and funeral on cbc.ca/BC. I'm Michelle Elliott. We'll leave you with images from the procession for Constable Rick O'Brien.